My name is Malcolm Bisby. I've been interested in industrial history for many years, and as a personal initiative, I've done extensive research into the story of the finding of a high-grade form of ironstone in the Rosedale Valley, and found it such a fascinating story. I felt it would be worth sharing with others, and I've made a series of 4 DVDs from talks I've given at village halls. Part 4 deals with the closing years of the Rosedale enterprise, with a more detailed description of the calcining process and the subsequent recovery of what was initially thought as calcine waste and turned out to be a valuable commodity. And then the conclusions of the whole operation. What did it achieve? Was it worthwhile? Did it make a contribution to the country's industrial revolution? So, in effect, we draw our conclusions at the end of talk 4. So, at part 3, we left it where we arrived at the east side, and we were looking at what were called the iron kilns. These were of new design. We haven't found out how these operated. There were no plans left, no operating methods, no records of operating methods. We do know that apparently they were a reasonable success, more efficient than the old stone kilns, which we'll see later on. It's certainly been exaggerated. They were credited by a chap called Matthew Snowden, who was with the discoverer of the magnetic ironstone in the Rosedale Valley, William Thompson, when he made the discovery. Matthew Snowden has left records and writings. He's made 1 or 2 errors in that. We know now that some of the stuff he talks about isn't accurate. One of the statements that is in his writings is that these kilns, the so-called iron kilns, were so efficient they were charging only 1 ton of coal to 26 tons of ironstone to enable the calcining process, the heating process, to do its job. Now that is certainly a huge exaggeration. He's got his figures wrong somewhere, because I'll be discussing, and we'll see later on, the design of kiln that was finally working at the blast furnace sites was achieving those figures of fuel efficiency, but nowhere would it be possible to achieve that efficiency out on a site like this with those type of kilns. Anyway, let's crack on. So we can see on this slide, we think was taken round about the 1920s. We can see that the hoppers at the top, those hoppers that you can see level with the top of the kilns, they're wooden hoppers, and they were storages for coal supplies that was necessary, of course, to operate the calcining kilns, provide the fuel for those. And there was a coal road at the top. Wagons of coal were shunted up there to supply both the kilns and also the workshops on the top, the blacksmith shop and the rest. Cottages at the top. This is all that remain of several cottages, some occupied by miners and their families. 1 or 2 at least were mining offices. And we can see, this is the opposite, the other side of those cottages. We can see the interesting pattern of the chimney flue ways. There were back-to-back cottages, and it was a typical type of industrial cottage of the time. Unfortunately, have deteriorated hugely, and evidence that from a very early point in time, lintels were stolen and used for other jobs. And here we can see still the sleeper marks of the trackbed that ran immediately outside the doors of these cottages. I mean, it must have been a dangerous traffic along there, the rail traffic, when the mines were working at their height, would have been very frequent. So, of course, you had to take the greatest care when stepping outside your doorway. We moved further along, and this is the remains of the blacksmith shop, very important in the working mine, constantly in need of sharpening picks and chisels and mining drills and that sort of thing. We're on the top of the kiln, the iron kilns, so-called iron kilns. We can see refractory brick line the inside of the kiln to protect it against the pretty intense heat. We don't know what the operating temperatures were, but I would guess somewhere around about 500 to 600 degrees centigrade. And here we see the particular shape of the chamber. The iron kilns were divided into 3 cells, and this is the shape of the chamber. The back of the chamber was curved to the front of the construction, and that presumably, with the weight of the untreated stone as it descended, would help to push the stone that has already been through the heating process out towards the front to aid the calcining rakers, as they were called, raking out the finished or the treated stone from the base of the kiln. Took this photograph in 1968, and we can see that along the base of the thing there are these vent tunnels. Now, this is something we don't really understand. There were big iron doors at the front of the kilns. Obviously, they could operate some sort of a shutter arrangement to control the air feed into the base. The firing would take place along the base here. You can see how the refractory brick has fallen away. You can see the colouring of the stonework where it indicates how much heat there was in that, operating in that area there. The object would be to try and keep the burn as even as possible. So you don't want hot spots all at the front or the back or whatever. They obviously had mastered this to a pretty good degree. We don't understand how they did it. So we're going to put some effort in this year, a colleague and I, trying to work out how it was done. This photograph I took in 2004, and again you can see this shaping of the chamber would help. It curves quite significantly at the base towards the front. And these hopper trucks, because when the calcine ore was raked out, it was pretty hot. If you put it into wooden wagons, obviously the wagon wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. And they made these 8-ton hopper trucks. They ordered 300 of these at the very beginning of the operation of the Rosedale Railway. This particular hopper truck was the last remaining of its type. I understand, I think it was Doncaster Works it was restored at in the days of British Rail, and they did a first-class job, and since then it's been destroyed. Would you believe? It's been destroyed, having gone to all the trouble to restore it. Now then, this is an example of the type of design of kiln that finally was operating at the blast furnace sites. So no longer was it necessary for calcined ore to be done on site. It was done partly reduced transport costs, roughly a third of the ironstone mine. It was the Dogger seam, and this particular ironstone out of Rosedale was iron carbonate, FeO, ferrous oxide, and the carbonates represented something like a third, well certainly 20% at least, of the weight of the stone. It wasn't wanted, and that was driven off by heat. So the ironstone as mined, when it was roasted, and it needed to be roasted to break down the large lumps of ironstone, which couldn't be accepted by the blast furnaces, reduced the transport costs, obviously, but it wasn't a very cost-effective method in the sense that the efficiency of the calcining process was poor. Anywhere from taking 1 tonne of coal to 8 to 12 tonnes of ironstone, or even something like one in the better kilns, probably, I'm guessing roughly 1 tonne of coal to 15 tonnes of ironstone. Now, these were cylindrical kilns. 2 principal designers of these were John Jers, a Swedish engineer who designed and built the Ayrsham Ironworks in Middlesbrough, and another chap called James Borry, Scottish chap, and they designed similar kilns. They were wrought iron plated, refractory brick lined, and the operation was such that the burn was very even and very efficient, and they were achieving something like 1 tonne of coal to 25 or 26 tonnes of ironstone treated. The other advantage was, in the James Borry design, he put in a sinter splitter. When the ironstone is roasted, it tends to sinter, and it makes it more difficult for it to be raked out at the bottom. This was an iron cone built in at the base of the thing, which automatically, with the weight of the burden, these were being constantly charged. It wasn't a batch process. It was being constantly charged from the top, and then, of course, raked out at the bottom. Now, of course, it's hot, and they were able to then, with pneumatic or hydraulic lifts, the Armstrong lift was a hydraulic lift, water operated, and the John Jay's design of lift hoist, as they call them, that was pneumatically operated. And they simply took the hot iron, calcined ironstone out from the bottom, put it in the hoist, and then it was taken up to the top of the blast furnaces, which were nearby, and on a gantry system, and charged in at the top of the blast furnaces. And there's a charging gate there, and the charge is dropped into the top of the blast furnace. And the so-called bustle was a manifold ring around the base of the blast furnace where hot air under pressure is blasted in, and with a system of heating stoves, this air is heated to over 700 degrees centigrade. So the combination of hot calcined ore and this hot blasting in at the base of the blast furnace at over 700 degrees centigrade was very fuel efficient, and great economies were made by these new techniques. And of course, intensely high temperatures were being achieved, 1500, 2000 degrees centigrade in the melt zone. And the gases that are driven off, carbon monoxide. Now, carbon monoxide is flammable, and that was collected and piped down to the heating system to heat the air that blasted in from the heating stoves to the base of the thing. So the whole thing was geared to operate as efficiently as possible. When the Hollins mines closed in 1885, having pretty well worked out all the so-called magnetic ironstone there, the winding engine, which is this thing, steam-operated winding engine, was moved across from the west side to the east side and became the motive power for dragging tubs of ironstone out of the east mines. And this engine replaced something like 100 pit ponies, and this was achieved by, well, I don't know how long it took them to move 1885 and re-establish on this side, probably, I don't know, possibly 6 months or something like that. And of course the stables, the farm, looked after these 100 horses, and of course the lads, the horse drivers, they would be either given alternative work or made redundant. Now, as usual, of course, the Victorians made use of every natural aid that they could possibly have. So that engine, that stationary winding engine, had to be bedded on a firm bed. And what better than a piece of ordinary rock that's sandstone that's part of the hillside. So all they did was find a suitable site, put the engine on that, and the stonemasons carefully, beautifully cut out this shape for the flywheel to clear the stonework. So they left this lovely shape, and of course it's still there to this day. If you walk up and have a look around, you'll find it. Now, in 1879, the Rosedale and Ferryhill Mining Company, which had operated the mines from 1861, hit hard times and went bankrupt pretty quickly, almost overnight. And eventually, round about 1882, 81, 82, the Cart9 Company, they had furnaces in Middlesbrough, they took over the East Mines and also Sheriff Pit. Eventually, they installed this generating plant, which was very advanced for its time. I mean, I only know of two mines in Cleveland that operated this electric power system. One was at Great Avon, at Monument Mine, and this one in Rosedale. In 1900, it was quite exceptional. A massive diesel engine, a single cylinder obviously, driving a generator. This provided principally power for electric drills, for drilling the blasting holes into the rock face. There is a story of that also it did operate the haulage system. That is a big demand, and I'm surprised if just one generator could cope with all that. But nevertheless, that is the story, that the haulage was eventually electric haulage. So let's have a look at the so-called stone kilns further down towards the depot end of the Rosedale east side. Here we see the north end of the kilns. There's 16 kilns. They look as though they were designed to be in sets of 4, and it's quite possible that in this particular case they would operate a batch system. So you'd have a set of 4 that were actually recharging, a set of 4 that were actually in the process of raking out, and a set of 4 that were halfway through the heating stage, and probably at the far end a set of 4 that were just being lit. And it's perfectly possible that that system operated effectively. You were getting a continuous supply, but in sort of a series of batches. Whereas the iron kilns would be almost continuous. It was too big an operation to relight a new charge every time. And at the top we can see this ventilation chimney. We'll talk about that in just a moment. I took this slide deliberately. There were heather burning at the time, and the smoke was filling the valley. And I wanted to give you the impression of what it was like. These kilns were operating all the time, 24 hours a day. And what it must have been like for the inhabitants of Rosedale when those kilns were operating. I mean, you'd have this continuous pall of smoke in the valley. There would be times when weather conditions blew us away over the moors, but often it would be hanging there night and day. And it must have been pretty miserable for people, and certainly a very unhealthy state to be in. I took this shot from the opposite side of the valley just to give you a perspective of the setting of this thing. We see again this ventilation chimney. There were other ventilation chimneys across the moor. They've all since disappeared. This is a copy of the 1883 Ordnance Survey map, I think it's 25 inches to the mile, showing the layout of the rail system on the east side with the mines and the kilns. And this was a photograph of the same ventilation chimney taken around in the late 50s. Now, nobody's been in the Rosedale mines, there isn't access, but we know how the system worked, because this is the ventilation system in Monument Mine in Great Ayton. Now, I've been in this, we're not supposed to do, but I've been in this many times, and we're very fortunate that this example remains. It's probably the only example in existence. And here we see the fire bars. I mean, it was massive. The fire bars, which are lengths of rail, and they burn anything, railway sleepers, old coal, anything that would burn. And here's a hood arrangement. They could close this hood to help the draw. The effect was, naturally, and back of the fire there's a vertical shaft that goes up onto the top of the moat, like we've just seen. And the effect is that, of course, a large volume of air is drawn in to the firebed, obviously. And by very clever use of what they call Brattice doors, it was arranged that that fresh air coming into drawn into the mine by the fire, could be directed round miles of galleries and workings before it finally got to the fire. So it ventilated the mine. So it didn't go direct to the firebed. It had probably done 2 miles before it got to the firebed, and the 2 miles were through all the mine workings. But it was done cleverly with Brattice doors, and you'd have trapping lads, young boys, 7, 8, 10, whose job it was to sit there by each Brattice door and open and close the doors. Tubs of ironstone were passing through, or people were passing through. But, in effect, controlling the airflow around the mine. It was crude, but it was effective. And most of the mines in Cleveland, drift mines of this nature, used that method. Fortunately, flammable gases were almost non-existent. Some of the bigger mines, like the Eston mine and Huntcliffe and ones like that, and Skelton Park, they needed a more efficient system, and they used giant paddle wheels, centrifugal fans, driven by steam engines. An example still exists in the Eston Hills, and they could shift huge volumes of air. And shaft sinkers were the people who built these shafts, who actually dug the holes and down to the mine workings, sank the shafts for where you had a mine that was a shaft mine. And of course, Sheriff Pit was, in a sense, a shaft mine. It was simply used for access, for haulage of ironstone to surface. But nevertheless, it was a shaft, 270 feet deep. And these were the people who built those. And you can see their peculiar sort of helmets. These were thick leather helmets, well, a bit like the old fireman's helmets, with a neck apron. And when they're down 200 feet and still digging, small pieces of stone, remember that at this stage that the lining of the shaft hasn't been completed, and small pieces of stone falling from a height of 200 feet, even if it was just a tiny pebble, if it hit your unprotected skull, would do some serious damage. So these were protective helmets, and the shoulder pads were the same. These were thick leather pads that protected their shoulders. It must have been a pretty awful job to have, but nevertheless, there were plenty of shaft sinking teams. There was a shaft chimney on the roadside, out of Rosedale, travelling towards the main moor road on the straight section there. There was a shaft there, and that was known as Jack Sharp's shaft. named after the ganger who was in charge of the shaft sinkers, Jack Sharp. It's since been destroyed, but if you go hunting around, you'll see the mound, and if you look around, you'll see bits of old brickwork and everything. Oh, here's the remains of a mine entrance. These were blown up around about 1950. I have a witness who, as a young lad, was one of the many children who used to go into the Rosedale mines, East mines, West mines, and parents were most concerned that, this was extremely dangerous. They could easily get lost. I mean, the workings in Rosedale East side extend nearly 3 miles under the moors, and the children could easily get lost, if not killed, of course, falling stone. And they prevailed upon the authorities, and local quarrymen who had explosive licenses came and blasted round about 1951 all the entrances so that they were inaccessible, and that was Thorgill, that was West Mines, and it was the East Mines. And here we see a photograph taken in 1900 of tubs of ironstone emerging from one of the entrances on the East Mines. Now these tubs, strangely, the mining tubs, often were made on site. You think they'd buy them in from, established manufacturers, but these were actually Rosedale's own particular design. And ironstone tubs varied in capacity. The typical ones were 1.5 tons or 2 tons, but it could go as much as 3 tons or even 1,500 weight, 3/4 of a ton. But I guess these are round about, possibly the way they pile them up, we're looking at least at 1.5 tons. We don't have any shots, obviously, as I've just explained. There's no way into the Rosedale mines. But this is Monument Mine in Great Ayton. This is the one that contains the remains of the furnace ventilation. And again, I took this photograph. It's got a very safe roof, relatively, compared to other mines. And this was the case with Rosedale, relatively. But nevertheless, you only have to look over time. You see the rubble that's accumulated on the floor, and that's all from the roof. And if you're unfortunate and it just happens to be the time for a chunk of stone to drop and you're under it, hard luck. This particular mine closed in 1923, so all this has accumulated since then. This team of miners, they're not of Rosedale vintage. They're from Johnny Monday's pit in Normanby. But I put it on to show you. Firstly, that all their breeches are tied at the knee. The reason for this is the mines were crawling with rats and mice, and if you didn't take that precaution, you did get rats or mice up your trouser leg. It's happened to me, both trouser legs, at the same time, and it's not a nice experience. These dockets were the things that the miner, this was the identity of the particular miner who'd filled that tub of ironstone. So he took one of these dockets off when he'd filled a tub of ironstone, hung it on the tub, and when it went out of the mine and was weighed off, it was credited to him. So that's what they were carrying there. These drills, many of them, of course, had to be hand-operated with a crank system. Electric drills came much later. But these they'd have a sort of crude winding system, a bit like a normal hand drill on a big scale, for drilling the shot firing holes. What else can I show you? Midge lamps, there's an example there. Now, the illumination in the mines, of course, was reliant on candle power. It was safe because explosive gases were extremely rare. It did happen on a couple of occasions, and there were fatalities in Cleveland, but it relatively unheard of. And these were, they made them themselves. A bit of an old bean can cut out with a candle in would serve as their illumination. Here we see a drilling mark, but you can see the shot firing hole here. The explosion has blasted the block of ironstone clean off, shattered it, and of course you're left with this clean face with the remains of the shot firing hole. Mining accidents were frequent, of course, in those days, and one particular case, as an example, George Bailey, a miner, was working New Year's Eve 1894, working his shift in the East Mines in 1894, and he was unfortunate in that there was a roof fall and his leg was very badly injured. He was taken back to his cottage. It was, of course, New Year's Eve, and winters in those years were pretty horrendous. Rosedale Valley was actually cut off. The normal course of events, with a major injury, a miner would be transported by horse and cart to Pickering Station and then transported by rail to York Hospital and treated there. Now this couldn't, in the case of George Bailey, this couldn't happen because of the fact that the Rosedale Valley was cut off. He was taken to his cottage and attended by the local village doctor, who tried to sort the injury out as best he could. But after some days, the fear of gangrene setting in became a serious concern, and George Bailey was actually laid on his kitchen table and given chloroform, and in the crudest way he was operated on, and his leg sawn off. He made a full recovery actually, and his mining days were over in the sense of actually working inside the mines, but he later moved to a mining company in Great Ayton, 15 miles away, and he presumably was some sort of surface worker, maybe a way clerk or whatever. And this was sort of a typical injury incident of those years. One of the big hazards of the mining era were injuries caused by blasting. One of the problems was that until the invention of the safety fuse, miners made up their own fuses, and this was simply a length of straw, hollow straw obviously. They'd pack it with gunpowder, not absolutely packed tight, but introduced gunpowder grains into the straw, and then when the preparation of the blasting hole was complete, it had been packed with gunpowder and stemmed, and the drawer was introduced, and it was then lit with the candle that the miner used for illumination, and he quickly dodged out of the way and hoped that when the blast went off he would be in a safe position. This didn't always happen, and sometimes the fuses, as such as they were, went off prematurely before the miner had even time to get out of the way, and severe injuries could result, even death. These were the conditions in which miners were working. Many accidents were caused by carelessness, but one has to understand the primitive conditions that miners worked in, the poor levels of illumination. They were essentially on piecework. If they didn't produce, they didn't get paid. So the incentive was to cut corners wherever it would give them an extra bit of income. And unfortunately, rules weren't in place. Mine owners were more or less free to introduce their own working conditions, and safety wasn't always top of the book. On this particular photograph, we see some lads dressed in their Saturday night best climbing aboard the brake van, and one of the things that used to happen quite unofficially, nobody talked about it, it just happened every Saturday, was the brake van would normally be parked down at the East Depot, the east side of the valley, and somehow it would appear at the Blakey Junction on a Saturday night, round about sort of 7 p.m, and the likelihood is they're getting a lift up to Blakey. From there they will go to the Lion pub, or probably down into Farndale to a village dance, village hall, whatever, and then mysteriously on a Sunday morning the brake van would appear parked in its usual place down at the East Depot. And it was clear that these lads, what used to happen was they'd spend their Saturday night at the pub, the Blakey, or down in Farndale. They would arrive back at Blakey Junction, they would board the brake van, and because of the gradient from Blakey Junction down to the East Depot, they simply released the brake on the brake van and coasted all the way down the 4.5 miles down to the East Depot, and of course it would be left parked in its usual place, and it would be all ready for use for operations on the Monday morning. And this was an unofficial, untalked about event that used to take place on a regular basis. The discovery of ironstone in Rosedale posed a problem in terms of how to accommodate the influx of miners and their dependents into the valley. When at the start of the operation, the total population of the Rosedale Valley, which was essentially an agricultural area, was in the region of 535 souls. By the time the mining operation had peaked, the expansion had reached nearly 3,000, just about 2,900, and it posed immense problems of accommodation. Any particular farm building that could be spared was pressed into operation, renovated. The company was frantically involved in building cottages to accommodate the workers. 2 rows of cottages, high row and low row, were constructed by the company, and also other areas were expanded, cottages wherever possible taken over, renovated, such as were the standards of the time. When the mining operation expanded onto the eastern side of the valley, 2 rows of cottages were built, known as Florence Terrace, and then School Row, and then High Street cottages. And all told, this was just about sufficient to accommodate the influx of miners and their families, dependents, whatever. The expansion of numbers of people in the valley of course meant a need for supplies, and hence a number of shops. All told, the maximum number of shops at the peak of the mining operation totaled 6 altogether, but the mining company maintained an absolute grip of who entered the village to start up a business, and they were vetted by the company, and the condition in which they traded was that a percentage of their profit was paid over to the company. So the company was using every opportunity to increase its profits, even to requiring a kickback from shop owners. Of 6 in total would contribute a significant amount of money to the mine owners, bearing in mind the number of families who would be really trapped in the valley, forced essentially because of distance and transport to do their shopping entirely within the bounds of the valley. In the 1920s at High Shop, it traded in all forms of groceries, but it also traded in things like suits and drapery of all descriptions, ready-made suits and whatever. But principally it was grocery supplies, and by the 1920s they'd got themselves a delivery van, and here we see a photograph of that van with two of the delivery drivers posing for the photograph. You can tell by the appearance of the van that it's of that era, the 1920s. So that shop was still trading in. I actually met the owners, and I first went there, saw it in 1975, and actually talked to them, and it hadn't changed. It was a time warp. You went inside, and there were these marble top counters, long counters, the old-fashioned counters, with the brass weigh scales and the old-fashioned till, and stuff in bags, sort of. In the old days, soap powder, soap flakes actually came in sacks. Cheese was wrapped in hessian. You cut pieces of cheese from a great chunk of it, and bacon, of course, was sliced on the old-fashioned machine, where it was hand-operated machine. And there was a certain smell in those places. It was a mix of soap flakes and cheese and bacon and it was a wonderful smell. It was a wonderful smell, and it was just a time warp, and it was just incredible. And they traded until the late 1970s. Then finally it closed down. But it had hardly altered. The shop inside was just as it used to be, and it was still called High Shop at the outside. So finally we come into the closing days of the railway. After 68 years, it's been a remarkable operation, a feat of engineering, civil engineering. Here we see a steam train leaving for the line top, and it's got its full load of wagons with a brake van at the end. Now then, there isn't a problem here of the incline. You can see obliterated by the smoke there, but that is quite a climb up there, quite a grading. I've got the measurements, but I don't want to bore you with all that. So it limited the number of wagons of ironstone that could be one locomotive of the power of those days. It was limited out of Rosedale East to 8 loaded wagons and a brake van. Now out of Rosedale West side, because of the shallower gradients there, they could tow 15 loaded wagons. And we're heading here around the curve. Now, a railwayman who retired in 1912, in 1867, he was a fireman on one of the locomotives, on the leading locomotive, and it was winter time. And they were heading out of Rosedale East, and they had a banking engine because the tracks were heavily inundated with snow. So they had what they call a banking engine, which was pushing from the rear. So they had travelled a quarter of a mile, and it got really difficult. And the locomotives were absolutely full, all steam on, throttles wide open, when suddenly the lead locomotive, the coupling between the locomotive and its tender snapped, and the side chain snapped. The engine leapt forward, took off like a greyhound. The crew fell off the footboard at the back. I mean, they fell into snow, and the locomotive threw itself off the track and went rolling, described as end over end, down the hillside. The crew were uninjured because they'd fallen into snowbeds. They managed to race down to the loco, laying on its side, and rake out the fire, because had it been left, it would have boiled dry and burnt out the tubes and everything. So they saved it, but of course it had to be taken away for repair. This same driver, a most unfortunate man, this same man, I should say, by 1872 was a driver, still working on the Rosedale Railway, and this time he was approaching the east side as what they call a light engine. He was going down to collect a rake of wagons with a part load of stone, apparently. He came to a place known as Robin's Cutting. Now, we're not sure where Robin's Cutting is. It could be the big cutting that I've already shown you on the earlier part 3. It could have been one before that, at the head of the Rosedale Valley. We simply can't identify which is Robin's Cutting. But as he arrived at the cut, or just before the cutting, to his dismay, the railway gangers had removed a whole section of track. They didn't expect, this was an unscheduled run, and they didn't, obviously they were timing it in the normal run of things, and they hadn't expected this. So there was a whole section of track missing. And he says that in his description that as they reached the actual missing section, he and his fireman bailed off, and this engine went rolling down the hillside, completely smashed up, very steep. If I think I know where it is very steep, and he almost certainly they would have been killed. So that was 2 incidents, 2 derailments involving this unfortunate man, Mr. Aspinall, who retired after 50 years of service on the Rosedale Railway. So another little story there. It could have been on this round this headland here, but I simply don't know. 4 photographs showing the final years of shunting. Stone, old uncalcined stone by this time, is being brought down this chute and loaded into these wagons. And this old guy, I think it was John Watson, an old miner, his days of employment, I'm afraid, were coming to an end. Now there was a murder, the one and only murder, but it was a gruesome one on the Rosedale Railway, and it took place at Incline Foot. The chap was named Frank Ward. This is the only photograph we've got. Poor photograph taken in his garden at his cottage at Incline Cottages, at the foot of the incline. And he was 68 years of age. He'd worked as a bankman on the incline for 40 years. He was very careful about his money. He didn't trust banks, and his house had been burgled, and he had lost some money. So he was in the habit of carrying all his life savings with him. And in today's money, worked out with, inflation, it worked out at somewhere around about £8,000. It was £100 actually, but such is inflation. We were talking 1924. So his habit was that on a Friday night they got paid, and he would have his tea and evening meal, and then he had a habit of walking the 3 miles to the village of Ingleby Greenhow, where he paid off the butcher, grocer, and then he went to the pub for a pint. And that was his routine. Now, a fellow railwayman by the name of Hubert Dalton, known as Jerry, a so-called friend of his, was a bit of a spendthrift and was in the habit of counting money alone from old Frank Ward from time to time. Anyway, Frank Ward set off from his cottage. There's his daughter Violet, who was his housekeeper, and this is his cottage. Look at that's a 2 up, 2 down. That's all it is, Look at the track outside. This is outside your garden gate, and this is a very busy section. Anyway, there's daughter Violet, who was his housekeeper. He set off on this particular evening and didn't return. and he was booked. He had a concessionary ticket. He was going on holiday to Whitby with his daughter on the Saturday. He didn't arrive back home. She was frantic with worry. Eventually, as dawn broke, she contacted her next door neighbour, who was the ganger boss of Frank Ward, Edward Carpenter, and the alarm was raised. Police were called, a search was made, and poor Frank Ward was found beside a haystack near the railway with his head smashed in. He had been struck 7 times on the head with something like a hammer. One of these hammer blows had penetrated his skull. Also, he'd had his throat cut, and all his money was, his pockets were turned out, 2 watches were gone, and all his money. So, while the police were there and making this discovery, they saw Jerry Dalton staggering out of the field, covered in blood, collapsed by the railway, and it was as though he also had been attacked by some mysterious assailant. It transpired that Jerry Dalton had been at the pub, and this was the pub that Jerry Dalton and Frank Ward used to frequent. On the Friday night, Jerry Dalton visited here, was drinking and spending freely, not a wise thing to do, and then, of course, the following morning, he staged this farce of a pretense that he'd also been assailed. Anyway, he had a throat injury. He cut it with a razor. It was stitched up. He was sent to hospital, and then the police mounted a search of his cottage. And this is Poultry House Crossing, we've already seen. This is where the track ran, and the far side was where Jerry Dalton lived. This was a semi-detached Poultry House Crossing at Ingleby. They searched his house, and they found in a shed outside a purse with a concessionary ticket made out to Whitby, to Frank Ward, with Frank Ward's name on it, and then they made a further search of the field area and found a piece of sacking with a blood-stained hammer in it and some money. And so eventually he was brought before the magistrates at Stokesley Town Hall, which is still there, Stokesley Town Hall, and he was remanded to York Assize, where he went on trial. And he pleaded, his defence pleaded he'd had an epileptic attack, was temporarily insane, and didn't know what had happened. The evidence was that after being in the pub at the Dudley Arms, he was worried that he probably hadn't quite killed poor old Frank Ward, so he returned to the body and cut Frank Ward's throat, and then he reenacted this scene. Anyway, the jury, for some reason, couldn't decide whether he was really insane or not. So he was then remanded and sent through to Leeds Assize for a retrial. The jury there took 5 minutes to find him guilty, and 3 weeks later he was hanged. And those days they didn't mess about. So that was the one and only gruesome murder on the railway. So we've had everything. And here's the final days, 1920-ish. The salvaging operations going on. All these tubs are for scrap, and there's a system here for operating a tipping scheme for salvaging the calcine dust. The calcine dust, don't imagine it as a dust that blows around. It was quite heavy, it's like wet sand. It was actually iron oxide, and they found a way of dealing with this. They thought it was rubbish. Waste, I mean, it was thrown away as waste at the time, vast quantities. And then they found that it was rich in iron oxide, ferric oxide. And so they started to salvage it. Trials had been done in 1917 to prove that they could actually process this through a blast furnace. And so 230,000 tonnes were salvaged, and this kept the railway going for another 3 years. And here we see all the wagons drawn up, ready for loading from. These are the heaps of calcine dust, almost like digging out solid stone. And they had a pattern for doing it. It was a very interesting way of working. It was the most efficient way of recovering this. Here we see a tramway where they're digging out the dust from the base and transferring it up to the tipping point at the top. And here we see, there's a tub of calcine dust being tipped into a hopper, which in turn is being tipped into these, what they call slipe wagons. 230,000 tonnes eventually was salvaged. And here we see the way they work. Fascinating. It's worth a study, but we haven't got time. Here we see, again, the way they operate was they always worked so that they were throwing down rather than throwing up. But it was the pattern, and you can tell how high the heap was. That's Peck's Cottages, way below. And they've already taken the top off the heap. And that's Peck's Cottages down there. And this little girl, this is the end of the line, really, before the rails were lifted. And this little girl would live to say, in her teens, would probably, by that time, the railway would be a part of history. And the mine manager's house and the structures all disappeared in as early as 1912. The mine manager's house remained, actually. These structures disappeared. The mine manager's house remained, but eventually, of course, fell into ruin. And it was seriously helped along by the World War II manoeuvres on the moors, where it was shot at and bombed and goodness knows what in army practice manoeuvres. And that's all that remains today of that structure. The engine shed at Rosedale West Side, 1937, was dismantled. It's the first good example of recycling. It was dismantled and transported to Huttonley Hall, where it was rebuilt as the village hall. All that you can see today is the pits, what were the engine pits of the structure. There's a two-row shed, and the pits were obviously for servicing. And if you go along, next time you're around Huttonley Hall, just have a look at the village hall, and you'll see a date stone there, 1939. And that stone was previously the Rosedale engine, west side of the and the Blakey Junction, the cottages, dilapidated, existed certainly until 1956, but very shortly after that they disappeared. There were good structures. There were 7 of these. They'd be worth a fortune today with the views that they had. If they'd been done up, and they were sold for hundreds of thousands of pounds. Anyway, they weren't. It's all gone. And the crossing, the busy crossing at Bloworth, wild and desolate and space though it was busy. And the crossing gatekeeper's house deteriorated to that in the 50s and then eventually disappeared. And that's the view today of that same crossing point. And the Ingby incline, frantically busy, of course. It was the choke point for the whole system. So this was incessant clatter and noise and dust. Another shot of the cottages in the incline at the close of the business. And here this little group, and Mrs. Tamara Featherstone, and that's her husband, said that the life at the incline top, unshielded from the weather, Siberia, it was nicknamed Siberia, was the happiest time of her life, and she bitterly regretted having to leave and go down to Battersby Junction cottages. And those are the views on good days that they would get. I took this shot in, I don't know, 2004, something like that. And it was one of those glorious days where the mist was just lifting from the valley below and the skies were clear and it was going to be a wonderful sunny day. And they would get views like that, but then of course they would get views where it was, well, they wouldn't get views at all, it would just be a blot out. Final wagons lowered down the incline, and the last locomotive, 8th of June 1929. Centre wheels removed because the angle change was so severe that had the centre wheel been left in, as the engine was lowered off, it would have cantilevered out, rotating on the centre wheels, and would have been seriously a serious danger. So the centre wheels were taken out, and that enabled it to follow the contour of the gradient down without cantilevering. And this was the scene about 1938, and that was the scene when the war started, but it was believed, erroneously, that this was a mark point for the German bombers as they approached Teesside to bomb the Teesside docks and this chemical works, steel works, etc. So the engineers, Royal Engineers, blew it up. But, you know, we had the Tees estuary. You didn't need any other way marked. The Tees estuary is big enough. You know where you are. So it was a bit of a, they were obviously enjoying blowing things up. I know the feeling, I've been involved in that as well. And here we see what was also remaining. These are the so-called kits where the empties were rolled up, pulled up over the top there, and this was the centre route for the loaded wagons. Don't know when this photograph was taken, there's a cable still there. Now these cables were at least 1,450 yards more long than that, probably 1,600 yards long, and weighed 8 tons. So it's surprising that that wasn't salvaged as well. But I know for a fact that that was there well after World War II. A friend of mine who was a boy at the time says, yes, he remembers that cable lying there when he was raking around that area. This was a photograph I took of my children and a friend's children, and the incline then had been resurfaced. The Forestry Commission were using it, and it was a passable road. You could actually drive your car up there if it was up to it, 1 in 5. And it was quite good, but since then it's deteriorated. Water drainage has ripped it out. And the remains of the brake drum house, of course, and some of the accoutrements, you know, this is obviously to do with a crank system for the brakes, for the band brakes on the huge drums. This is the remains of the brake drum houses, which obviously would control the speed of ascent and descent. What was it all about? Well, it was massive. I mean, the operation of Teesside operation, which included Rosedale, produced these incredible developments. This is Middlesbrough in about 1909, 1910. This is Newport Road. I mean, you can't believe, you go down Newport Road today, you can't believe that ever existed. Newport Iron Company, just look at the rail system alone. This is all produced from iron made from ore that mined in the area, including Rosedale. These are iron pigs. These are iron pigs, smelted in South Tees Ironworks back here, and stacked for transport for steel making. This is the John Jay's Ayrstone Works, blast furnace works, 1873, just finished construction. This is the engine house that produces the blast that feeds the hot air into the base of the blast furnaces. This was so advanced for its time that it was 1966 before it was demolished. 1966. And that was 1873. I'm minded of the lines by Rudyard Kipling, The Secret of the Machines. We were taken from the ore bed of the mine. We were melted in the furnace and the pit. We were cast and wrought and hammered to design. We were cut, filed and tooled and gauged to fit. And here is a length of rail. I photographed this. It's since disappeared, unfortunately. Photographed this around about 2002. And it tells us that it was forged in Consett, County Durham. It was the year 1874, and we know that in that period, all the ironstone from Rosedale was specifically shipped to Consett and Ferry Hill. So it's almost certain that this length of iron rail back in Rosedale was originally ironstone out of mined in Rosedale, and has come back as a length of rail. And it reminded me of those lines by Rudyard Kipling. This is a photograph I took of number 2 blast furnace in Clay Lane, Middlesbrough, in 1969. And it's all gone. It's all disappeared. There's nothing there now. But when you look at that photograph, and it was 1969, it could have been 1869. You know, you just look at it. It's Dickensian. I mean, I called it Hell's Kitchen, which upset. It won a competition. It upset the site manager, the blast furnace site manager, who wrote me a letter, an indignant letter, saying he didn't like the title. It suggested unsafe working. Well, the accident statistics at the time were horrendous anyway. And of course, latterly, it's an ever-changing world. And this is this was the super blast furnace at Teesside, Redcar. There it is, that one there. I can't remember when I photographed this, 2002, I think. And that's all finished, shut down. And this was super efficient. I mean, this was producing something like 7,000 tonnes of pig iron a day. And it was producing more in a day than half of the Victorian blast furnaces of Middlesbrough and Stockton in 1910. It was super efficient, but of course world demand, competition and all the rest of it. So unfortunately we've lost it, and it's the end of an era. So the whole saga is one of constant change. So nature has taken over. The scars of the mining operation, which was severe, has been taken over by nature, and once again Rosedale is an absolutely beautiful place, well worth walking around if you haven't already done it. And in future years there'll be walkers who will come across sections of the Rosedale Railway and wonder what on earth a standard gauge railway track bed is doing on the wild North Yorkshire moors. You know, they'll think, what on earth is that for? But we know, don't we? Okay?